Welcome to the Leaders in Payments podcast, where we talk to C-level leaders from across the payments landscape. We'll be discussing the products and services that impact the payment space today, as well as trends and predictions for the future of payments. We will also hear stories from our guests about their journeys to the top.
When we work with bigger retailers at Brite, we typically do business cases together with them where we align on certain assumptions around basically what the volume shift could look like. And we model sort of certain payment costs. And there is a huge amount of money to be saved, not so much just on the payment fees, but primarily on the lack of fraud and chargebacks.
That was Lena Hackeloer, the founder and CEO of Brite Payments, and she is my special guest on this week's episode 265 of the Leaders in Payments podcast, and I'm your host, Greg Myers. Brite is an account-to-account payment method in Europe, and they also provide instant payouts. Lena leveraged her fintech career to start Brite Payments in 2019. She provides some great insights into the future of payments and has some powerful advice for those just starting in our industry. We've got a great episode ahead, so let's get started. Hi, Lena. Thank you for being here and welcome to the Leaders in Payments podcast.
Hi, Greg. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. So let's just dive right in. Tell our audience a little bit about yourself, maybe where you grew up, where you went to school, where you currently live, a few things like that, and we'll dive into your professional background in a minute.
Excellent. I'm Lena. I'm the founder and CEO here at Brite Payments, a second generation based in Stockholm, Sweden. However, I am born and raised in Germany. So I come from Western Germany, a town called Dortmund, actually, where I grew up and also went to school. So spent my entire childhood there, all the way up until graduation and high school. And then after that, started moving a little bit all over Europe and eventually also to the US, and then ended up in Sweden in 2010 when I started working for Klarna, which I'd like to think is one of the better known fintechs in Europe at this point, but that wasn't the case back when I started. So I spent some time living in the UK, in France, in Norway, and then eventually I moved to Sweden. So that is my background very much in short.
Awesome. Well, let's talk about Brite Payments, and I just want to spell it Brite for those who are listening. They will, if they go look it up, they will spell it correctly. Brite Payments. So tell us what Brite Payments does.
So at Brite, we are focused exclusively on instant account-to-account based payments, meaning we allow consumers to pay online using only their bank account. And also to receive payments using only their bank account, which may sound like nothing special if you think about the nature of online banking nowadays. But what we've done is that we've turned this into a payment method. So our primary customers are merchants who go ahead and they integrate our payment methods and then offer them to consumers in return. So that means that we can fuel anything from classic e-commerce to financial services to marketplaces and the likes, but also, of course, for the instant payout segments, companies like insurance companies that are looking to pay out claims to their customers, or, for example, the gig economy, where we allow companies to pay their freelancers, for example. So we handle various money flows, always online, always account-to-account based, and always instantly. That's one of the core propositions of our payment methods, that we handle all of our payments instantly. And we do that on the back of, first of all, open banking. So we leverage open banking to process our payments, but we have also built our own proprietary platform called the Brite Instant Payment Network, Brite IPN, which is a pan-European instant payment network that spans at this point across almost 25 countries. So we're fairly spread out all across the continent, allowing customers to pay and get paid with Brite.
Okay, and when did you start the company?
I started in 2019, so very much after open banking became a topic in Europe, which means that we're actually able to leverage the open banking APIs. So the company at this stage is a little over 4 years old. We launched in 2020. So we're licensed in Sweden with passporting all across Europe. So this is our third year of full operation, if you will.
And just so that the audience and I completely understand. So if I'm going to a merchant that has Brite as a method of payment, I'm going to see that as a choice, just like I would see to pay with MasterCard, Visa, or any other kind of payment method. Is that correct?
Yes, precisely. So we are actually a consumer-facing payment method. Okay. The solution is plug and play. So unlike other actors in the market, we don't offer an infrastructure that merchants can build their own product on top. We are actually the full-fledged product. So consumers will always be aware of that they're using Brite, and we're also receiving all the funds on behalf of our merchants. So there's no, separate bank accounts involved that merchants need to have or settlement accounts. We do all of that. So we're not a B2B white label play, but rather a fully fledged consumer-facing payment method.
Okay. And then you also have to connect with banks. So tell me how that kind of process works with a consumer clicks on it. I'm just trying to kind of walk through a use case. Consumer clicks on Brite, then what do they do?
Exactly. So we are connected to more than 3,800 banks across Europe at this point. And what we mean by that is basically that those are the banks that we offer consumers to pay through, precisely as you say. So basically, if you picture yourself being a consumer, you would go to any checkout, you would choose Pay with Brite. What we would show you is all the available banks in any given market. You would then proceed to choose the bank that you bank with, authenticate yourself, choose the bank account you want to make the payment from, and then sign off on the transaction. That's it. So you don't need to sign up. You don't need to download anything. There's no passwords involved. All you need to make a payment with Brite is actually a bank account in the market that you live in. And then you're basically ready to go. We're quite focused on the consumer experience. So what we've done is we've actually boiled this process down that usually consists of 2 authentication steps into 1 authentication step for all returning users. So when you come back one more time after already having used us, what happens is that you'll be landing straight on the bank account that you used to make that payment last time. And when I mean landing on the bank account, what we'll show you is effectively your bank and the current balance in this account, nothing more. So it's not that you get to see all of your transactions or anything like that. Just basically this as an entryway to make a payment from this particular bank.
All right, so it saves me putting my 17-digit number in and all that painful things that consumers often have to do.
Precisely. You would never have to do that with Brite because we go ahead and fetch that directly from your bank, actually. So all you do is you authenticate with top-of-mind information. So think of it as same credentials that you would use to log into your online bank. That's all you'll need.
Yeah.
So in many markets, we can take Sweden as a good example, what you would use is your personal number, and then you would authenticate with what we call bank ID. In most other markets in Europe, you would just authenticate through your online banking app on your phone. So no need to memorize any additional passwords or putting in, long numbers. Whatever you need to go and log into your bank, that's what you can use to make a payment with Brite.
And you mentioned a few kind of merchant types that use the service. Are there specific verticals or segments of industries that are more apt to use it, or can it be really any online business?
It can really be any online business, as long as, of course, it's within our risk appetite. There's, of course, as any other major payment company, there's areas that we don't want to get involved in. But generally speaking, you could use us to pay anything online. What I would say where our type of payment method is particularly strong is in anything that is consumed or delivered instantly, but also, of course, traditional e-commerce. Where I would say account to account is not as prevalent today is typically in verticals where you would order multiple items with the intention of not keeping everything. So, for example, fashion is a really good example because a lot of customers will go ahead and order, the same item in multiple sizes, or they're going to order, they maybe have the intention to buy one sweater and they order 5 and then they want to choose which one they want to keep. And there, typically you don't want to prepay. So that would be one of those verticals where maybe we are less strong as of today, but any other vertical, literally, where there's a clear intent to buy, there's a really good fit to our product.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the payouts side of it a little bit. Was that part of the vision when you started the company, or was that something new that you've brought on since you started?
No, that was actually something we already have invested quite heavily in right from the get-go, primarily because there's a lot of use cases that benefit from both payments and payouts. And I think marketplaces is a really great example. So, for example, we power AuctionNet, which is a really cool player up here in the Nordics. They are essentially a marketplace for auction houses. So if you run an auction house in any given European market, you can sign up with them and then they become your online storefront, so to say. So as in any marketplace scenario, you will have a buyer, but you will also have a seller. And they are right in the middle between those two. So there's 2 types of money flows here. The first one is, the regular purchase situation where somebody buys an item on the marketplace or basically on an auction house and they need to pay for it. But then there is also a seller who's waiting to get paid for the item they sold. And we can handle both of these flows. So that's a really good example, I think, of use case that actually needs both. But of course, there's also use cases that only need payouts. And this is, I think, very much a market segment that is overlooked today. Because when we think online payments, I think we all think of online shopping and paying an online retailer. That is sort of the classic use case. But there's a lot of payouts use cases as well. And I think I've given some example, but there's many, many more that maybe you wouldn't think of when you think payments, but are actually pretty significant in terms of the number of transactions and also the amounts of funds that are being transferred. So that was very much with us from the get-go already. Yeah.
And what would you say differentiates your company from your competitors out there?
I would say that sort of the high level of instant processing is a big part of our USP. And the reason for that is that it's not just very convenient and has a lot of value for the user, but it also takes away a lot of the credit and fraud risk that you would be used to from payment processing. So for example, if you compare us with credit cards, I think most merchants will be familiar with the pain of chargebacks and fraud, for example. And the fact that we authenticate customers using something super secure, such as their online banking app, but also the fact that the funds are being transferred so quickly actually eradicates a lot of that risk. And that makes the payment processing a lot more efficient for the merchant. And of course, a lot more predictable in terms of costs as well. So that is a really big proposition and something that we currently invest a lot of time and money into to make sure that we can have the absolute highest instant coverage that we can possibly offer. And IPN, our network that I mentioned before, actually provides instant payments in markets where there is no public instant processing scheme available. So that goes to show us how much of a focus this is for us. Other than that, we're also fairly young as a business, which means that we were able to build our services, state of the art, from scratch in 1919, 1920, and of course continuously ever since. Whereas there's other players in the industry that have been around for longer, that have also been focused on account to account, but maybe not on the instant processing. Maybe they were more focusing on the actual initiation of a payment, which by default most often is not instant in most markets across Europe. So those are, I think, some of the core factors that we hear from merchants, at least, are the reasons why they chose to work with us.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but account to account is much more popular in Europe than it is in the US. Is that correct?
Yes, I would say so, yeah. And it's not a European phenomenon per se, because there's many markets across the world that have similar initiatives to open banking in Europe, whether that is South America, whether that's India or Australia. This is sort of a global phenomenon. It's on the rise, but it's definitely sort of more popular in Europe than at least in the northern parts of America, so the United States, definitely.
Okay. And you're today just doing business in Europe, is that correct?
That's correct, yeah. We're focused on Europe for the time being.
In the payments and fintech industry, before a transaction takes place or money is ever moved, there's a plethora of activity that takes place. So, in collaboration with NMI, the fully integrated payment solution built to scale, we've launched the Be Solid campaign, where in this series, we're exploring everything that happens before the transaction, with guests from leading companies like Count, MasterCard, Trustly, and more. To listen to the latest episodes, visit leadersinpayments.com or nmi.com/resources/podcast. In a world full of squares and stripes, be solid. Where do you see the payments industry, and if you want to answer it sort of from the lens of the segments that you work in, you can absolutely do that. But where do you see the payments industry headed, say, in the next 3 to 5 years?
Well, of course, open banking is definitely on the rise. So I see open banking payments replace a lot of the card payments in Europe. That is, of course, top of mind for me, given that this is my core business. Other than that, or otherwise I wouldn't have started the company, quite frankly. But the overall sort of trend that I see is that there is more convergence across the different markets. And I think this is maybe from a, say, North American standpoint, something that can be quite daunting if you look at the different European markets. What we see is that there's still quite massive local differences. So every market will typically have their own local payment champions and local payment brands that are unique to that market or a subset of European markets. But there's few payment methods that span all across Europe, cards aside, and maybe, some wallets, like obviously PayPal is fairly popular across Europe to varying degrees in the different parts, but still. And I would imagine that there would be more convergence as certain players, of course, expand beyond borders. So that's definitely one thing that I see. I also think that embedded finance is becoming a bigger topic across most European markets in the way that we all interact with payments. And I think generally speaking, given that the regulatory field is also becoming more harmonized across Europe, that of course also paves the way, along with some infrastructure development, such as, for example, the SAPA Instant Scheme that also fuel this development. So I foresee, and I also hope, that it's going to become easier for larger merchants across Europe to process payments all across the continent.
Yeah, and you talk about open banking and sort of this account-to-account payments. How has the popularity grown? Is it like driven by merchants encouraging consumers, or is it banks encouraging consumers? How do consumers I think your everyday consumer doesn't say, "Oh, I'm going to use open banking." Like that's not what they do, right? But they see Brite as a payment method. Like, how do you get more consumers more into account-to-account payments?
Oh, that's a very good question, actually. Perhaps answering the first part of your question first, I would say that the popularity is actually accelerating, and we see that sort of the number of open banking users in Europe from 2020 to now next year, 2024, has basically almost quadrupled. And that is the expectation that we have for 2020. So it's definitely something that has been accelerating, and that is sort of a growing trend across consumers. But you're, of course, perfectly right. Open banking as a concept is very abstract. And I would say that 99% of consumers have no idea what open banking is. To them, the payment method will be something that is closer to a pay with my bank concept, where they will see the bank that they currently use. They will recognize the logo. And then basically the fact that it's processed by Brite is, of course, in all honesty, not going to be the decisive factor at this point in time. However, there's great examples across Europe where different providers have managed to carve out a market position that has a very strong impact on consumer preference. I think one fantastic example is Sofort in Germany, which I would say is perhaps the original account-to-account play in Europe. That company at this point, I think, is 15 years old. They were acquired by Klarna in, I think, 2014. I was working in Klarna at the time, since I spent so many years there. And they actually, up until today, have more than 90% brand awareness. So German consumers are already very much familiar with the concept. And then that is actually, it falls into the category of open banking, but consumer will not perceive it to be an open banking player, if that makes sense. So they will not label it that way, at least. I am, of course, intimately familiar with Sofort also because Brite has a partnership with them. So any merchant that uses Sofort, they can actually use our instant payouts, because Sofort doesn't do instant payouts. They only do payments, regular open banking payments. That's why I know so much about it. But this is just one example in a European market where there already is great pickup amongst consumers and preference for this type of payment method. And there's other examples, but they're all focused, on one market or the other. They're not really pan-European players at this point. And with regards to your question as to what needs to happen to make this a more popular phenomenon, I would say that definitely the merchant plays a big role, right? Because they stand to reap the benefits of streamlining their payment operations, and by shifting volumes away from card processing to open banking. When we work with bigger retailers at Brite, we typically do business cases together with them where we align on certain assumptions around basically what the volume shift could look like. And we model sort of certain payment costs. And there is a huge amount of money to be saved, not so much just on the payment fees, but primarily on the lack of fraud and chargebacks that come with the cost. So in my point of view, the merchant sort of is the first instance to roll this out as a popular payment method because they have the incentive. And if they position open banking payments or instant account-to-account payments, which is how we like to think of our category, then of course the consumer preference will follow because they're being exposed to it by the merchant.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about you. So tell us about your journey to your role there as the CEO and founder at Brite.
Yeah, I have a bit of a peculiar, I think, journey, given that I didn't become an entrepreneur until after I became the CEO of another large payment company here in Sweden. So as I mentioned earlier, I started out in Klarna. I joined that business when I was just 25, so pretty much straight out of college. And I was very fortunate because I worked for the founder of Klarna for many years. So I witnessed this extreme hypergrowth and fantastic journey that they went through firsthand. When I started, we were just over a bit over 100 people. When I left, we were a few thousand. And at Klarna, I was very focused on building marketing, primarily B2B marketing, actually, since that was very much the focus. Klarna also underwent this journey where they first focused on their merchant population. And once there was a very large, number of merchants offering the service, only then they shifted more and more focus to the consumer. So also a B2B2C play, similar to what we do at Brite. And I spent my years there, and eventually after 7 years, took the very heavy decision to leave, which was difficult. It's a great company. And I first became the CPO and then later the CEO of another BNPL player in the Nordics called Qliro Financial Services. And in Qliro, I started looking more at basically the payment ecosystem as a whole, because we were covering a number of different payment methods, not just BNPL. We also had a direct-to-consumer offering. So I took a bit of a step back and started thinking about, okay, what are the categories in Europe that are going to be growing further down the road? And I stumbled upon account-to-account as a massively growing category. I started to understand sort of what I thought were the benefits of account-to-account and how they could appeal basically to the different stakeholders, primarily, of course, merchants, but also consumers. And on the back of that, I decided to start Brite. So I had already done, shall we say, quite a classic career in online payments before I decided to start my own business. So I have a lot of admiration for people that start businesses right out of university. It's not my journey. Mine is different, but that's how I ended up here. And now I can't really see myself do anything else at all.
Thanks for sharing that. Well, what are some things you're passionate about? So maybe one work-related passion and one personal passion.
Work-related, I am very, very curious by nature. So I love to work with our merchants. I think it's super interesting to understand the different business models beyond just, of course, what we can do for them. It's always fantastic to understand your customer's challenge, don't get me wrong. But I think that basically anything that is online commerce in the wider context is really, really interesting. So I really love to spend time with merchants and understand how they operate, looking at warehouses even. Back in the day in Klarna, people used to joke about me because I would be so interested in seeing how packages are being sent and all these things. So I'm genuinely really, really passionate about e-commerce. And that's probably because I've been doing it for about 15 years, even if I'm on the supplier side of things, of course. And on a more personal note, I love to travel. Having lived in all these different markets, of course, is not a coincidence. So I love to be in different markets, or countries, learning different languages, spending time locally. And that is, of course, something I can combine with our geographic spread at Brite quite often. So I can get really passionate about spending time, for example, in Spain, where we have another large office. So that's another passion of mine, is just basically spending time in as many different places as I possibly can.
And what advice would you give? Let's say someone's coming to start at your company. Maybe they're coming right out of university and they say, hey, I want to build a career in payments or fintech. And they come to you and they say, Lena, what do I need to do to be successful in this industry? What advice would you give them?
I would say perhaps the most important thing is to develop a genuine interest in not just the immediate area that you're working in, but also in basically everything that is surrounding your business and the wider industry as such, because payments is complex, right? I mean, we notice this over and over again when we recruit people that are not from the payments industry. We have a lot of people here at Brite that have over a decade of experience, some even 2 decades of experience in fintech and especially in payments. But if we have new colleagues joining that come from, for example, from the B2B SaaS space, but without payments experience, for example, you realize wow, it's actually quite complex, right? Like understanding the different roles the different players play. So what's a PSP, for example, compared to a payment company, to car processing, to the APM, the alternative payment method space. And I think this is quite essential to understand if you want to successfully navigate and get a better sense of what are the challenges and how can you appeal to different stakeholders. So, lifting the view and widening the perspective, I would say, is the number one thing. Secondly, of course, there are at this point in time, and this is quite different to, 15 years ago when I started my journey in fintech, is there is actually best practice at this point. When we first started out in Klarna, or when I started just a few years into that journey, there was no such thing as best practice because everything was new. Now you can actually spend time and you can research the actual journey that some of these payment businesses have been on and the way that their business models have evolved, especially in comparison to the markets that they operate in. And you can see how companies have pivoted. You can see now, for example, take a wallet like PayPal. You can see basically how their consumer proposition would have evolved from when they first started to where they are today. And I think there's a lot to be learned, a lot of inspiration to be taken from that. So I would encourage everybody who sort of spends time or wants to have a career in fintech to just spend time in learning the underlying or understanding the underlying basically mechanics of the industry, and also trying to learn from how business models have evolved, because I think it'll really help you get a broader understanding of where you can take your business and what your contribution to that journey could be.
I love that idea of, having curiosity, and this space is very complicated. I mean, I've been in it for 20 years and I probably know 2% of what, about the industry, because there's just so much and it changes. And to your point, the other thing that's happened, I think in the last 10 years or maybe even last 5 years, at least I know in the US, you can now take fintech courses in college. And of course, right, we didn't have that before, So absolutely, to your point about learning about best practices and how companies have pivoted based on the industry dynamics, I mean, we just didn't see that before. So I think that's a great answer. So thanks for sharing that. Well, Lena, we've covered a lot of ground about you and your background, and obviously about Brite, the company, and where you see it heading. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up the show?
No, other than thanking you for getting the opportunity to spend time with you here. I myself really enjoy listening to podcasts, listening to other founders. So it's great to get the opportunity to have a chat with you. So thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I know your time is very valuable. So again, I really appreciate you being here.
My pleasure entirely. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And to all you listeners out there, I thank you for your time as well. And until the next story.
Thank you for joining us this week on the Leaders in Payments podcast. Make sure you visit our website at leadersinpayments.com, where you can subscribe to the show and where you'll find our show notes. If you enjoyed listening, please share on your social channels as well.